Elon Musk's SpaceX launches Starlink Gen2 satellites to orbit and received FCC clearance. To start its Starlink Gen2 satellites before the end of 2022, SpaceX has requested and received FCC clearance. The first component of the corporation's Gen2 network, 54 new Starlink satellites, was sent into orbit today by the company. SpaceX hasn't clarified what, if anything, makes these satellites unique, given that they were launched on a Falcon 9 and that Starship, which hasn't yet entered orbit, is needed for the genuine next-generation Starlink gear. Hello and welcome to KYC News. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Recently, the Starlink 5-to-1 mission's Falcon 9 rocket lifted off. Only one more Falcon 9 launch is scheduled for 2022, making it the 60th overall. We have grown to anticipate textbook precision from the Falcon 9, and the mission itself was no exception. The first stage booster descended to rest on the company's A Shortfall of Gravitas drone ship after launching the second stage into space. The satellites were launched into the intended orbit, making them the first to contribute to the company's 7,500 FCC-allotted satellites. The gear is visible in the video feed after the cargo fairing was launched, even though SpaceX did not provide any information about the satellites. Like all previous Starlink launches, the 54 satellites are stacked within, but the Gen2 satellites are said to be substantially bigger and more powerful. So, what defines this mission as Gen2? For the upgraded Starlink network, the satellites were placed in a new orbital shell approved by federal regulators. These satellites may be utilized to test elements of the real Gen2 hardware, or they might be utilized to improve communication until Starship is complete. According to Elon Musk's SpaceX, the Gen2 expansion will resolve the congestion problems that Starlink has been experiencing into 2022. At the time of its introduction in 2020, Starlink offered latency that was not too dissimilar from wired broadband and speeds of up to 100 megabits per second, which were several times faster than those of conventional satellite internet. Speeds have slowed due to the high demand for Starlink connectivity, thus the business plans to impose household data limitations shortly. The first orbital test of Starship was supposed to be finished in 2022, according to SpaceX CEO Elon Musk, but that didn't happen. Although SpaceX's brand new mega rocket hasn't flown in months, the Super Heavy first stage, which is needed to launch Starship into orbit, has been undergoing static fire tests. The more potent Gen2 Starlink satellites will be deployable by Starship once it is finished, but that is just the beginning. Starship will also be used by SpaceX to do the suborbital surface-to-surface transfer on Earth, assist NASA's Artemis lunar missions, and go to far-off places like Mars. And Musk continues to maintain his desire to populate Mars. You need a mega rocket to do that. It's been over a year and a half since we've seen a prototype of SpaceX's next-gen Starship spacecraft fly, with its first flight with a Super Heavy rocket has been perpetually pushed back during that time. Musk, who also currently helms Tesla and Twitter, tweeted Saturday that he's hopeful the first orbital flight of Starship could happen as soon as next month. We have a real shot at late February. March launch attempt appears highly likely, he wrote. SpaceX launched a series of Starship high-altitude flights in 2020 and 2021 that saw a 3-engine version of the spacecraft fly to the stratosphere and come back for a series of landing attempts that all ended in explosions except for the final, successful attempt on May 5, 2021. Shortly afterward, SpaceX announced that it would switch gears to begin producing more Raptor engines, testing Super Heavy booster prototypes and preparing for the first orbital launch of Starship. The plan is for Starship to blast off from the company's Starbase facility in Texas atop Super Heavy, which will return for a landing on a platform in the Gulf of Mexico after separation, while the Starship vehicle continues on for a quick trip to orbit, followed by a splashdown landing in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Hawaii. The flight plan has been stymied by a number of delays, largely tied to the process of getting a launch license from the Federal Aviation Administration. The company's application first had to go through an environmental review process that lasted several months, concluding with the agency allowing the mission to go forward but requiring SpaceX to make dozens of modifications to its launch plan. The company still hasn't secured its permit to launch from the FAA as it works through the required changes while simultaneously continuing to manufacture and test Raptor engines and get Super Heavy ready for its first launch. The next Starship flight has been just a month or two away, going back to June 2022, when the FAA announced its decision, and this latest update continues that pattern. SpaceX isn't the only party with an interest in seeing Starship fly again. NASA has selected it to be one of the vehicles it flies to the moon as part of the Artemis program aiming at returning astronauts to the lunar surface this decade. The company still hasn't secured its permit to launch from the FAA as it works through the required changes while simultaneously continuing to manufacture and test Raptor engines and get Super Heavy ready for its first launch. The next Starship flight has been just a month or two away, going back to June 2022. When the FAA announced its decision, and this latest update continues that pattern. SpaceX isn't the only party with an interest in seeing Starship fly again. NASA has selected it to be one of the vehicles it flies to the moon as part of the Artemis program aiming at returning astronauts to the lunar surface this decade. After over a year and a half of waiting, it's clear that Starship's first trip to space is getting really close and that the next step involves a whole lot of fire. The rocket that Elon Musk aims to use to send astronauts to the moon and many more humans to Mars could make its first orbital flight within weeks, and SpaceX is now going through some of the final items on its checklist to prepare. Reports and action from the company's Starbase rocket development facility in Texas point toward a possible static firing of Booster 7, an early prototype of the Super Heavy booster designed to push Starship out of the atmosphere. On Monday, the company completed the vehicle's first full wet dress rehearsal, which means SpaceX loaded propellant into the rocket and ran through the countdown, simulating everything right up through blastoff without actually lighting up the engines. If all the data from the run-through checks out, we may see the static firing in the coming weeks. A static firing will see the booster secured to a test stand so it can't go anywhere while its engines are lit up briefly to test them and gather data on how they perform in preparation for launch. SpaceX conducted test firings of Booster 7 last year, but only with a fraction of the engines it's designed to carry. This will be the first time a fully loaded Super Heavy with all 33 engines is ignited. SpaceX did not immediately respond to a request for comment. A successful static firing could indicate SpaceX is getting near the end of its checklist of things that need to happen before the Federal Aviation Administration issues the company a license to launch. We may finally see Starship leave the planet as soon as late February or early March, according to Musk. Starship last flew in 2021 in a series of high-altitude flights that saw early prototypes of the craft, sans Super Heavy booster, skim the atmosphere and come back for a landing attempt. The next launch will be an orbital flight that sees Super Heavy launch Starship to orbit before separating and splashing down in the Gulf of Mexico. SpaceX has also mentioned the possibility of landing on a modified oil rig or using large mechanical arms on the launch tower to catch the returning rocket. Meanwhile, Starship will continue on to orbit for a short trip to space before splashing down off the coast of Hawaii. If all goes well, 2023 will see more Starship tests as SpaceX prepares to assist NASA and its Artemis program by eventually sending cargo and astronauts to the moon later this decade.